As Sarah sat in her favorite armchair by the window, she reflected on the many years of her life. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow across the room. She had always loved this time of day, when the world seemed to slow down and the peaceful quiet of the evening settled in. It was during these quiet moments that Sarah found herself contemplating the lessons she had learned throughout her life, lessons that had shaped her into the woman she was today. One lesson that had stood out to her, one that she had come to appreciate more as she grew older, was the gift of patience. It was a lesson she had not always understood, especially in her younger years. Back then, Sarah was someone who had always been in a hurry. She was eager to achieve her goals, to succeed, to move on to the next big thing. She believed that life was a race, and the faster she could go, the better. But as the years passed, Sarah began to see that this hurried pace was not always the best approach. She had learned that true peace and contentment came not from rushing through life, but from taking the time to pause, to reflect, and to allow things to unfold in their own time. The world, she realized, would continue to turn whether she was running ahead of it or walking alongside it. It wasn't until Sarah experienced the loss of her husband, Henry, that she truly began to understand the value of patience. Henry had been her partner for over 50 years, and his passing left a void in her life that she didn't know how to fill. In the months following his death, Sarah found herself struggling to cope with the overwhelming emptiness that now surrounded her. The days felt long, and the nights were even longer. She missed him terribly, and there were times when the pain of his absence seemed unbearable. But in the midst of her grief, Sarah learned something she hadn't expected to learn: patience with herself. She realized that healing didn't happen overnight. It wasn't something that could be rushed or forced. It took time. It took moments of quiet reflection, of allowing herself to feel the sadness, the anger, and the loneliness. And through this process, Sarah began to see that it was okay to not have all the answers right away. It was okay to take her time to heal. At first, Sarah found this realization frustrating. She was used to being in control, used to fixing things and moving forward. But the pain of losing Henry was something she couldn't fix. It wasn't something that could be rushed. It was something she had to sit with, something she had to allow herself to experience fully. And as much as it hurt, she began to understand that this process was a necessary part of her journey. As Sarah sat in her armchair, the memories of her life with Henry came flooding back. She remembered the early days of their marriage, the excitement and joy of starting a life together. She remembered the quiet moments they had shared, sitting by the fire, walking hand in hand through the park, and talking late into the night about their hopes and dreams. Those moments were now just memories, but they were memories that filled her heart with love and warmth. And as Sarah reflected on those memories, she realized that patience was not just about waiting for the pain to subside. It was about being present in the moment, appreciating the time she had with Henry, and recognizing that even though he was gone, the love they shared would never disappear. It was about accepting that life was a series of moments, some joyful and some painful, and that each moment was precious in its own way. It was through this understanding of patience that Sarah also began to learn how to be patient with others. She had always been someone who wanted things to be done quickly, to see results immediately. But as she grew older, she realized that not everyone moved at the same pace. Not everyone processed things the same way. Some people needed more time to heal, more time to grow. And just as she had learned to be patient with herself, She learned to be patient with others too. One of the people Sarah had become most patient with was her daughter, Lily. Sarah and Lily had always been close, but as Lily grew older and started her own family, their relationship became more complicated. Sarah found herself wanting to give her daughter advice, wanting to help her solve problems. But she also knew that Lily needed to find her own way. It was hard for Sarah to watch her daughter struggle, but she realized that she had to let Lily face her challenges on her own, just as she had faced her own. "Mom," Lily said one afternoon, "I know you want to help me, but sometimes I just need to figure things out myself. I appreciate your love and support, but I also need to learn my own lessons." Sarah smiled, understanding exactly what Lily meant. It was a lesson Sarah had learned the hard way. She had spent so many years trying to fix things, trying to make everything better. But now she understood that sometimes the best thing you could do for someone was to give them the space and time to figure things out on their own. Patience, Sarah realized, was not about being passive. It was about allowing things to unfold in their own time, trusting that everything would happen when it was meant to happen. It was about being present, being kind to yourself and others, and understanding that sometimes the best thing you could do was to wait. And in the waiting, you often found the answers you were searching for. As Sarah sat by the window watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had learned that life was not a race, but a journey. And in this journey, patience was not just a virtue, it was a gift that allowed her to truly appreciate the present moment, to be grateful for the experiences she had, and to trust that no matter what, everything would be okay in the end. Sarah sat by the window again, sipping her tea and watching the rain fall softly outside. The world seemed quieter today, as though the storm outside was reflecting the turmoil inside her heart. For years, Sarah had carried around a weight she hadn't been able to shake, a weight of resentment and unforgiveness. It had been something she had held on to for far too long, and it had shaped much of her relationships, especially with her ex-husband. When Sarah and Tom, her first husband, had divorced, it had been messy. Emotions had run high and bitter words had been exchanged. Sarah had always believed that Tom was the one who had abandoned their family, that he was the one who had chosen to walk away from the life they had built together. For years, she had held on to that anger, that resentment. She blamed him for everything that had gone wrong, for all the pain she had endured. But as Sarah grew older, she began to realize that holding on to that anger wasn't serving her. It wasn't changing the past, and it wasn't helping her move forward. It was only poisoning her heart, preventing her from truly experiencing peace. The more she held on to her resentment, the more she carried it with her like a heavy burden. One afternoon, as Sarah sat with her daughter Lily in the living room, they talked about forgiveness. Lily had noticed that her mother had been distant, especially when it came to Tom. She could see that there were still unresolved feelings, and she gently encouraged Sarah to explore those emotions. "Mom," Lily said softly, "I know it's hard, but I think it might help if you could forgive Dad. Not for him, but for you. You deserve peace, and holding on to this anger, it's only hurting you." At first, Sarah had been defensive. "But he hurt me, Lily. He left me with nothing. I raised our children on my own. He made his choices, and I paid the price." Lily nodded, understanding, but her voice was steady. "I know, Mom, but I also know that carrying around this pain is keeping you from healing. You can't change what happened, but you can choose how you respond. And forgiveness doesn't mean you forget what happened. It means you let go of the power it has over you." Those words stayed with Sarah long after the conversation had ended. She had always thought that forgiveness meant excusing the wrongs done to her, But Lily had helped her see it in a new light. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing behavior or letting someone off the hook. It was about freeing herself from the emotional chains that bound her to the past. It was about reclaiming her peace, her joy, and her future. Sarah thought back to the good times she and Tom had shared. They had once been in love, had once dreamed together of a future full of happiness. Those memories were overshadowed by the bitterness of the divorce, but Sarah realized that she couldn't let the past define her forever. She had to let go of the anger and make room for healing. It wasn't easy. Forgiveness never was. There were days when Sarah felt like she was being asked to forget all the pain, to erase the hurt that had been done to her. But she understood now that forgiveness wasn't about erasure. It was about releasing herself from the past, allowing herself to be free. In the weeks that followed, Sarah began to work on her forgiveness. She didn't call Tom immediately. She knew she wasn't ready for that yet. But she began to forgive him in her heart. She started to let go of the anger she had carried for so many years. And with each passing day, she felt lighter. It was like a weight was being lifted from her shoulders. One evening, Sarah sat at her desk, pen in hand, and began to write a letter to Tom. She didn't know if she would ever send it, but the act of writing was therapeutic. She poured out her heart, expressing the pain she had felt, the anger, and the hurt. But she also wrote about how she had come to understand that forgiveness was the only way to move forward. "Dear Tom," she began, her handwriting steady but emotional, "I have carried this anger for so long, and it has poisoned my heart. I have blamed you for everything that went wrong in our marriage, and for the pain that followed. But now I understand that holding on to this anger only hurts me. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to live in peace. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that this is the right step for me. I let go of the past, and I choose to move forward." As Sarah finished the letter, she felt a deep sense of relief. She had forgiven Tom. It didn't mean she had to forget, and it didn't mean that everything would be fine between them. But it meant that she was no longer a prisoner to her past. She had freed herself, and in doing so, she had found a new sense of peace. A few days later, Sarah decided to send the letter. She wasn't sure how Tom would respond, or even if he would respond at all, but she knew it didn't matter. The act of forgiveness was for her, not for him. It was her way of reclaiming her life, of letting go of the resentment that had been holding her back. In the weeks that followed, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace. The tension in her heart had eased, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free. She had learned that forgiveness was not about forgetting or excusing someone's behavior. It was about releasing the power the past held over her and making the choice to move forward with love and compassion. As Sarah sat on her porch one evening, watching the sunset with a cup of tea in her hands, she felt a quiet sense of contentment. She had learned one of life's most valuable lessons, the power of forgiveness. It was a gift, not just for those who had wronged her, but for herself. And with that gift, she had found the peace she had been searching for all along. As Margaret sat in her small garden, the sunlight filtering through the leaves of the trees, she found herself reflecting on the years that had passed. The simplicity of her life now felt like a gift, one that she had spent a lifetime learning to appreciate. It was only in her later years that Margaret had come to understand the profound beauty of simplicity. Looking back, Margaret realized that most of her younger years had been spent chasing after things: bigger houses, higher status, and more money. She had believed that success meant accumulation, that happiness was found in the number of things she possessed, or the title she held. But as the years went by, and after the loss of her husband, she found herself stripping away the excess. It was then that she discovered the true richness of life was not in material possessions, but in the simple moments that often went unnoticed. Her life had once been filled with noise, the constant hum of work, the busy social gatherings, the endless pursuit of achievements. But now, as she sat in the quiet of her garden, Margaret found peace in the stillness, the rustling of the leaves, the chirping of birds, the fragrance of flowers. These were the things that brought her joy now. She no longer felt the need to seek out the distractions of the world. She had learned to find contentment in the small, everyday moments that many people overlooked. One of the most significant lessons Margaret had learned was that happiness did not lie in the next big thing, the next promotion, or the next vacation. True happiness, she had come to realize, was found in living in the present moment, appreciating what was right in front of her. It was the quiet mornings with a cup of tea, the warm smiles of neighbors, and the sense of calm that came from being at peace with herself. In her younger years, Margaret had worked tirelessly to build a successful career. She had been determined to prove herself, to climb the corporate ladder, to make a name for herself, and for a while it had worked. She had achieved everything she thought she wanted: an impressive job, a beautiful house, a life filled with the kind of luxury she had once dreamed of. But when Henry, her beloved husband, passed away, Margaret found herself alone, surrounded by things that no longer brought her joy. It was then that she decided to simplify her life. She sold the big house, moved into a smaller, cozier home, and began to let go of the clutter that had accumulated over the years. She no longer felt the need to impress anyone or to keep up with the expectations of society. Instead, she focused on what truly mattered: her health, her relationships, and her peace of mind. One of the first changes Margaret made was to spend more time outdoors. She started gardening, a hobby she had always loved but had never had time for during her busy career. The simple act of tending to her flowers, watching them bloom, and caring for the plants became a source of great joy for Margaret. It was in the garden that she learned to slow down, to connect with the earth, and to appreciate the beauty of nature. It reminded her that the most precious things in life were often the simplest. In the past, Margaret had never had time to sit and enjoy the moment. Life had always been about what came next, what she had to do, where she had to go, what she had to achieve. But now she found herself savoring the quiet moments. She would sit in her garden for hours, letting the world around her slow down, appreciating the simple joy of being alive. She found peace in the little things: the scent of fresh flowers, the feel of the sun on her skin, the sound of birds singing in the distance. One day, as Margaret was tending to her roses, she thought about how much she had changed. In her youth, she had always been busy, always chasing after something. But now she understood that the secret to happiness was not in doing more, but in being more. It was about being present in the moment, about appreciating what you had, and about finding joy in the simplicity of life. She remembered a conversation she had had with her daughter, Emily, a few months earlier. Emily had asked her how she managed to stay so calm and content, especially after all the challenges she had faced. Margaret had smiled and said, "It's the small things, Emily, the moments that others overlook, the quiet moments, the moments of connection with others, the simple pleasures that life offers. These are the things that bring me peace." Emily had smiled in return, but Margaret could tell that her daughter didn't fully understand. Emily was still caught up in the whirlwind of life, the demands of work, the pressures of raising a family, the constant juggling of responsibilities. But Margaret knew that one day Emily would come to realize the same truth, that happiness didn't come from what you had or what you achieved, but from how you chose to live each day. Margaret had also learned that simplicity was not just about material possessions. It was about how you lived your life. It was about letting go of unnecessary worries, letting go of the need for validation, and embracing the present moment. It was about choosing to be kind to yourself, to forgive yourself for the mistakes you had made, and to live with an open heart. In the past, Margaret had been consumed by the need to prove herself. She had always felt like she had to do more, be more, and accomplish more in order to be worthy. But now she had let go of that need for external validation. She had learned to appreciate herself for who she was, not for what she had done or what she had achieved. As Margaret sat back in her chair, watching the sunset, she realized that the wisdom of simplicity was one of the greatest gifts she had ever received. She had spent so many years chasing after the wrong things, but now she understood that true contentment came from embracing the simplicity of life, from finding joy in the small moments, and from living each day with gratitude. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. She had learned that life wasn't about rushing or striving for more. It was about living in the present, appreciating what you had, and finding happiness in the simplest of things. She had found peace in simplicity, and she knew that this was the secret to a fulfilling life. Margaret sat in the cozy living room of her home, a cup of warm tea in her hands. The rain gently tapped against the window, a soothing sound that filled the room with a calm, peaceful atmosphere. It was one of those quiet afternoons that seemed to stretch on forever, giving her plenty of time to reflect on the lessons she had learned throughout her life. As she looked back on her many years, Margaret realized that one of the most valuable skills she had ever developed was the ability to listen. Not just listen to words, but truly listen. Hear what people were saying with their hearts, understand the emotions behind their words, and offer them the space to share their stories. It was a skill that had taken her years to master, but it was one that had deeply enriched her life. When Margaret was younger, she had often been impatient with others, eager to speak and share her own thoughts and opinions. She was ambitious, always driven to accomplish more and be recognized for her achievements. But as the years went by, she began to notice something. While she was busy talking, the people around her were often silent, holding back what they truly felt. Margaret realized that she wasn't really listening. She was merely waiting for her turn to speak. It wasn't until after Henry passed away that Margaret began to understand the true value of listening. In her grief, she sought out the company of her friends and family, but what she needed most was not advice or words of comfort. It was someone who would simply listen. She didn't want anyone to try to fix her pain or offer solutions. She just needed a safe space to express her sorrow, to share her memories of Henry, and to cry when she needed to. It was during these conversations with her closest friends that Margaret realized something profound. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the gift of listening. She saw how deeply it impacted her to have someone truly hear her, to be there without judgment or interruption. It made her feel understood, validated, and less alone in her grief. Over time, Margaret began to practice the art of listening more consciously. She started paying closer attention when people spoke, not just to the words they said, but to the emotions behind those words. She learned to read between the lines, to hear the unspoken fears and desires, to understand the needs and wants of those around her. Margaret discovered that listening wasn't just about hearing, it was about being present, fully engaged, and open-hearted. One of the most profound lessons Margaret learned was that listening could heal. It could heal broken hearts, repair damaged relationships, and foster deeper connections between people. She found that when she truly listened to others, they felt heard, and in turn, they listened to her. It created a cycle of empathy and understanding, where both parties felt supported and valued. In her later years, Margaret began to see listening as an art form, a skill that required patience, humility, and compassion. It wasn't just about waiting for someone to finish speaking so you could share your thoughts. It was about being fully present in the moment and allowing the other person to be heard. Margaret realized that by giving others the space to express themselves, she was not only helping them feel understood, but she was also deepening her own understanding of the world around her. One day, Margaret was sitting with her daughter Emily in the garden, enjoying the warmth of the sun on their faces. Emily had been going through a difficult time, juggling the responsibilities of work, family, and personal life. Margaret noticed the exhaustion in her daughter's eyes, the way she seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Mom," Emily said softly, "I don't know how to balance everything. I feel like I'm constantly running, constantly striving, and I'm not sure if it's all worth it." Margaret didn't immediately offer advice. Instead, she sat quietly, taking a deep breath, and then she simply said, "Tell me more. What's been going on?" Emily looked at her mother, surprised by her calmness and willingness to listen. For the first time in a long time, she found herself opening up, sharing the struggles she had been facing, the doubts that had been weighing on her heart. Margaret listened intently, nodding occasionally and offering a comforting presence. She didn't try to fix anything or offer quick solutions. She just listened. After a long silence, Emily finally said, "I didn't realize how much I needed to say all that. I've been holding it in, thinking I had to do everything on my own. But I feel so much lighter now, just by talking to you." Margaret smiled gently, feeling the deep connection between them. Sometimes all we need is someone to listen. You don't have to carry everything by yourself. You're not alone in this. In that moment, Margaret realized that the power of listening wasn't just in what was heard, it was in the way it made people feel. Listening allowed them to release their burdens, to process their emotions, and to feel understood. It wasn't about solving problems, it was about creating a safe space where people could express themselves without fear of judgment. As Margaret grew older, she continued to cultivate the art of listening in all of her relationships. She found that it deepened her connections with others and helped her understand the people around her on a much deeper level. Whether it was listening to her grandchildren talk about their dreams or comforting a friend going through a difficult time, Margaret found that the simple act of truly listening is one of the most powerful tools for creating meaningful relationships. One evening, as Margaret sat alone in her garden, reflecting on the many years she had lived, she realized that listening had been a constant theme throughout her life. It had been a key part of her relationships, her growth, and her ability to connect with others. And as she thought about all the people she had listened to over the years, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had learned that the most important thing in life wasn't what you said, but how you made others feel when they spoke. Margaret smiled to herself, knowing that the art of listening would continue to guide her for the rest of her days. She had learned that by truly hearing others, she had found not only deeper connections with them, but also a deeper understanding of herself. Margaret stood at the window, gazing out at the garden, her thoughts drifting as the wind gently rustled the leaves of the trees. She had always loved this time of year, when the seasons shifted and the world seemed to change with every passing day. It reminded her of the constant ebb and flow of life, how everything was in a constant state of transition. As she watched the flowers bloom and fade, she thought about her own journey of change. It wasn't always easy for her to accept change. In her younger years, she was reluctant to let go of the past, holding on to memories and routines that no longer served her. She resisted the changes that came with age, the shifting roles in her family, and the inevitable changes in her body and mind. But over the years, Margaret had learned that change was not something to fear. It was something to embrace. Change was a natural part of life, a force that shaped and molded us, helping us grow and evolve. As she aged, she began to see that the more she resisted change, the more difficult it became to move forward. But when she accepted it, when she allowed herself to flow with the changes, she found a sense of peace and understanding that she had never known before. The loss of her husband, Henry, had been one of the biggest changes in Margaret's life. When he passed away, she felt as though a part of her had been ripped away. She struggled to adjust to life without him, and for a long time she felt lost. But as time went on, she began to realize that her life wasn't over. It was simply different. Henry's absence didn't mean that she couldn't find joy again, or that she couldn't continue to live a fulfilling life. It meant that she had to embrace the changes that came with his passing and learn to navigate the new path that lay ahead. In the months following Henry's death, Margaret started to notice how people around her adapted to change in different ways. Some of her friends were afraid of aging, constantly fighting against the inevitable decline that came with time. They spoke of surgery and pills, desperate attempts to turn back the clock. Others, however, seemed to embrace aging with grace. They accepted that they couldn't stop the passage of time, but instead focused on the things they could still enjoy. Margaret admired their ability to adapt, and she realized that there was wisdom in their approach. One day, while having tea with her friend, Ellen, Margaret brought up the subject of change. Ellen had lost her husband many years ago and had learned to live on her own. Despite her grief, Ellen had always been able to adapt to life's changes, and Margaret wanted to know how she had done it. "You know, Ellen," Margaret said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking a lot about how hard it is to accept change. It seems like the older I get, the more things change, and the harder it becomes to keep up." Ellen smiled warmly, her eyes reflecting the wisdom of someone who had lived through many changes herself. "Margaret, change is the only constant in life. We can't stop it, no matter how hard we try. The key is to find peace in the changes. I've learned that instead of fighting against them, it's better to embrace them. Change can bring new opportunities, new experiences, and new ways to grow. The trick is to accept that we can't control everything, but we can choose how we respond." Those words resonated deeply with Margaret. She realized that for so many years, she had been trying to control her life, to keep things the way they were. She had been afraid to let go of the past, afraid of what the future might bring. But now she understood that change wasn't something to fear. It was something to accept and embrace. As she reflected on Ellen's advice, Margaret began to see the value in letting go of her fears and embracing the unknown. She had spent so much of her life focusing on what she couldn't change. And now, in her later years, she realized that there was so much more freedom in accepting what she couldn't control. By embracing change, she was able to let go of the burden of resistance, and in doing so, she found herself feeling more alive than ever before. One of the biggest changes in Margaret's life had been moving to the retirement community. At first, she had resisted the idea. She had been comfortable in her home, surrounded by the memories of her life with Henry. But after a series of health scares, she had realized that it was time to make a change. She needed a place where she could be surrounded by others, where she could have the support she needed, and where she could continue to live independently, but with help when necessary. Moving to the retirement community had been a difficult decision, but it turned out to be one of the best decisions Margaret had ever made. She found that the new environment was full of opportunities to learn and grow. She made new friends, started attending social events, and even picked up new hobbies. At first, she had been afraid of losing her independence, but she soon realized that there was a different kind of freedom in letting go of the need to do everything on her own. Margaret now spent her days volunteering, helping other residents, and sharing her wisdom with those who were struggling with the changes that came with aging. She had become a mentor to many, and she realized that embracing change wasn't just about adapting to new circumstances. It was also about finding ways to help others navigate their own transitions. She thought about how different her life was now compared to when she was younger. She had once been afraid of change, holding on to the past and the familiar. But now she understood that life was full of surprises and that the beauty of life lay in the unknown. She no longer feared the future. She welcomed it with the open arms, knowing that each new chapter brought its own set of opportunities and experiences. As Margaret sat on the porch, watching the sun set on another beautiful day, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had learned that change wasn't something to be feared. It was a natural part of life, something that could bring new beginnings and fresh perspectives. She had come to embrace the ebb and flow of life, and she had found that in doing so, she had found a new sense of freedom and joy. She smiled to herself, grateful for the wisdom that age had brought here. Margaret knew that life would continue to change, but she was no longer afraid. She had learned that the key to living fully was not to resist change, but to embrace it, to flow with it, and to find peace in the process. Margaret sat in her favorite armchair by the window, her hands folded gently in her lap. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, signaling the end of another day. She had always found comfort in the quiet of the evening, when the world seemed to slow down, and her thoughts could drift back to the many lessons she had learned over the years. As she looked out at the garden, now filled with the soft hues of twilight, Margaret found herself reflecting on one of the most important lessons she had ever learned: the value of time. Time, she realized, was the one thing that none of us could ever get back. No matter how much wealth we accumulated, no matter how many accomplishments we achieved, time was always slipping through our fingers. It was fleeting, precious, and unpredictable. In her younger years, Margaret had been so focused on building a successful life that she had often taken time for granted. She had always been in a hurry, rushing from one task to the next, always thinking about the future, never fully appreciating the present. She had worked tirelessly to climb the corporate ladder, believing that success would bring her the happiness and fulfillment she longed for. But as time passed, she began to realize that no matter how much she achieved, she could never catch up with the passage of time. It wasn't until after Henry's death that Margaret truly began to understand the value of time. The loss of her husband had made her painfully aware of how fleeting life was. In the days following his passing, she found herself reflecting on the many years they had spent together, and she couldn't help but wonder how much of their time together had been spent in a rush, always planning for the next big thing, always looking ahead. She wished she had spent more time truly being present with him, savoring the moments they had instead of always thinking about what was to come. Margaret's grief was not just for the loss of Henry, it was also for the lost time. She realized that the time they had spent together, although precious, had often been overshadowed by their busy lives, their ambitions, and their worries. And now that Henry was gone, she could never get that time back. She couldn't go back and relive those moments, no matter how much she wished she could. But over time, Margaret began to shift her perspective on time. Instead of mourning what had been lost, she started to focus on the present, the moments that she still had. She understood now that time was not something to be taken for granted, and that the most important thing she could do was to live fully in the moment, to appreciate the time she had, and to make the most of it. One afternoon, while walking through the park, Margaret saw a young couple sitting on a bench, holding hands and laughing. The sight of them brought a smile to her face, but it also reminded her of how quickly time passes. The young woman was probably no more than 25, and her life was just beginning. Margaret couldn't help but think of her own youth, of the time she had spent rushing through life, always thinking that there would be more time, always believing that there would be another day to do the things she loved, to spend time with the people she cared about. As Margaret watched the young couple, she realized how important it was to savor each moment, to cherish the people in her life, and to never take time for granted. She had learned the hard way that time was precious and that it was never too late to start living fully. She was no longer willing to waste a single moment on regret or worry. She wanted to make the most of the time she had left, to embrace every day with gratitude and purpose. That evening, Margaret sat at the dinner table with her daughter, Emily. They were enjoying a quiet meal together, and Margaret couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. Time with her family had become more valuable than anything else in her life. She realized that the time she spent with her children and grandchildren was the most precious gift she could give them, and she wanted to make sure she never took that time for granted. "Mom," Emily said, looking at her mother with a soft smile, "I've been thinking a lot about time lately. It feels like it just slips away so quickly. I don't want to waste it, but sometimes I don't know how to slow down and really appreciate it." Margaret smiled, reaching across the table to gently touch her daughter's hand. "You know, Emily," she said, "we all think there's always more time. We think we can catch up later, that we can put things off until tomorrow. But the truth is, tomorrow is never promised. What matters is what we do with today. The time we have right now is the most precious thing we can hold on to. So don't wait for the perfect moment. Take the time to enjoy the small things, to be with the people you love, and to live fully in the moment." Emily looked at her mother, absorbing her words. She had always admired Margaret's wisdom, and now, more than ever, she understood how valuable those lessons were. It wasn't just about being busy or achieving more. It was about being present, appreciating the time you had and making sure that every moment counted. Margaret knew that time was the greatest gift she could give to her loved ones. It wasn't about material possessions or grand gestures. It was about being there, truly present, for the people who mattered most. She had learned that the best way to spend her time was with the people she loved, creating memories that would last long after the moment had passed. As the evening came to a close, Margaret sat back in her chair, feeling a sense of fulfillment. She had spent so many years chasing after things, always thinking that there would be more time to enjoy the important things in life. But now she understood that the true value of time was in how you spent it, in the moments of connection, love, and joy that you created along the way. She looked out the window, watching the stars twinkle in the night sky, and felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that no matter how much time she had left, she was going to make the most of it. She was going to live fully, with purpose, and with a heart full of gratitude for the time she had been given. Margaret sat quietly in her favorite armchair by the window, gazing out at the peaceful garden. The day had been filled with ordinary tasks: watering the plants, tidying up the kitchen, and visiting with a few friends. It was the simplicity of these moments that she had come to cherish in her later years. Yet, as she looked at the beautiful flowers blooming outside, she couldn't help but think about the difficult years that had shaped her into the woman she had become. Life had never been easy for Margaret. She had faced numerous challenges along the way, many of which seemed insurmountable at the time. There had been times when she felt like giving up, times when the weight of the world seemed to rest on her shoulders. But through it all, she had found a way to persevere. It wasn't always graceful, and it wasn't always easy, but Margaret had learned the power of resilience. Her journey had not been one of smooth sailing. In her early 20s, Margaret had married Henry, the man who would become her partner for life. Their love had been strong, but life had thrown them curveballs. They struggled financially in the beginning, and they faced many setbacks that could have torn them apart. Yet they always found a way to push through, to lean on each other, and to keep moving forward. Their love was the glue that held them together during the most challenging times. But as life went on, the challenges didn't stop. The death of her beloved Henry was one of the hardest things Margaret had ever faced. It felt like a part of her had been ripped away, and for a long time she didn't know how to live without him. The grief was overwhelming, and for a while she wondered if she would ever find her way back to herself. Yet in the midst of her grief, Margaret realized something important. She had the strength within her to keep going. She could choose to wallow in sadness, or she could choose to honor Henry's memory by living the life they had dreamed of together. It was a choice that wasn't easy to make, but it was one that ultimately led her to a place of healing. Margaret often thought back to the difficult days following Henry's death. There were moments when she felt utterly alone, when the silence of the house was deafening, and when she questioned whether she could continue without him. But it was during those dark moments that she discovered her own strength. She realized that resilience wasn't about never feeling pain. It was about how you chose to move forward, how you found the courage to keep going even when the path ahead seemed unclear. One of the things that helped Margaret through her grief was her connection to others. She had always been a deeply compassionate person, but after Henry's passing, she found herself seeking out more human connections. She started volunteering at the local community center, helping others who were going through their own struggles. It was in giving of herself that she found strength, and in helping others, she found a sense of purpose. Through her volunteer work, Margaret met many people who had faced adversity in their lives. Some had lost spouses, others had lost children, and some had been through hardships that Margaret could hardly imagine. Yet, despite the pain they had endured, they all had one thing in common. They had found a way to keep going. They had discovered their own resilience, their own ability to rise above their circumstances and move forward. One of the people Margaret met was Barbara, a woman in her late 60s who had lost her son to illness many years ago. Barbara's grief was still raw, but she had managed to rebuild her life after the tragedy. Margaret was amazed by Barbara's strength and the way she had transformed her pain into something positive. One afternoon, as we're sitting together in the community center's lounge, Barbara shared her story with Margaret. "You know, Margaret," she said softly, "I thought I would never make it through. After my son passed away, I was devastated. I couldn't even imagine a life without him. But slowly I learned that life didn't stop just because I wanted it to. I had to find a way to keep going. And it wasn't easy, but over time, I learned to embrace the pain, to honor his memory, and to keep living. Margaret listened intently, her heart heavy with empathy for Barbara's loss. But at the same time, she felt a deep sense of admiration for the resilience Barbara had shown. It reminded Margaret that resilience wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about finding a way to live with it, to let it shape you, and to use it as a stepping stone to something greater. Margaret began to realize that resilience was a journey, not a destination. It wasn't something you just learned once and then moved on from. It was something you cultivated over time, something that grew stronger with every challenge you faced. She had learned that resilience wasn't about bouncing back immediately from hardship. It was about allowing yourself to grieve, to feel, and to process. And then, when the time was right, finding the strength to rise again. As Margaret continued her volunteer work, she found that she was becoming more and more connected to others. She shared her story, and in return, others shared theirs. The more she opened up, the more she realized that she wasn't alone. We all have our struggles, our heartbreaks, our moments of doubt. But it was in these shared experiences that Margaret discovered the true strength of resilience. One day, while walking through the park, Margaret thought about all that she had learned. She thought about how far she had come, how much she had grown, and how much strength she had gained. She had learned that resilience wasn't something you could force. It was something that arose from within, from your heart, from your will to live fully even in the face of pain. As she looked around, Margaret saw the people around her, people who were living their lives, each with their own story, their own struggles, and their own victories. She smiled to herself, feeling a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in years. She had discovered that resilience wasn't about never falling down. It was about having the strength to get back up, to keep going, and to live fully no matter what. Margaret knew that she wasn't done yet. There were still many years left ahead of her, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges along the way. But she also knew that with each challenge came an opportunity to grow, to become stronger, and to embrace the resilience that had always been within her. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Margaret took a deep breath and closed her eyes. She had come to understand the true meaning of resilience, finding strength in the face of adversity, and knowing that no matter what life threw her way, she would always have the courage to rise again. As the years had passed, Margaret had come to understand something profound. Family was not just an important part of life, it was the heart of everything. When Margaret was younger, she had taken her family for granted, assuming that they would always be there, that they would always be a constant presence in her life. She was so focused on her own ambitions and achievements that she didn't always appreciate the value of the connection she had with her loved ones. But with age, Margaret learned to see her family in a new light. The death of her beloved husband, Henry, had made her realize just how precious and irreplaceable the people in her life were. Without Henry, Margaret felt an emptiness that she hadn't known existed. And it was during that time of mourning that she truly began to understand the strength and support her family had provided for her over the years. It wasn't just her husband's death that had shaped Margaret's understanding of family. It was the years of love and shared experiences that had built the foundation of their relationship. Margaret had learned that family wasn't just about the people you were related to. It was about the people who stood by you through thick and thin, the ones who offered you their support, their love, and their understanding. One of the greatest gifts Margaret had received in her later years was the time spent with her children and grandchildren. Her daughter, Emily, and her son-in-law, Jacob, had become an important part of her life again. She had always been close with Emily, but as the years passed, their relationship had deepened. Margaret found herself leaning on Emily more, asking for her advice, and sharing her thoughts and feelings in ways she never had before. Emily had always been a source of strength for Margaret, but it was during her grief that she truly saw the depth of her daughter's love and support. Emily had been there for her in ways that Margaret had never expected. She had patiently listened to her, comforted her, and given her the space to grieve. Margaret had always been the one to take care of others, but in this moment it was Emily who was there for her. "Mom," Emily had said one evening as they sat together in the garden, "I know you've been through so much, and I just want you to know that you don't have to go through this alone. We're all here for you, and we'll get through this together." Those words had brought Margaret a sense of peace. She realized then that family was more than just blood. It was about being there for each other, about offering love and support no matter the circumstances. Margaret had spent so many years worrying about herself, trying to build a life on her own, but she now understood that family was what made life meaningful. It was the people you could turn to when everything else felt uncertain. As Margaret grew older, she made more of an effort to stay close to her family. She made it a priority to spend time with Emily and her grandchildren. Whether it was a Sunday afternoon in the park or a quiet evening at home, Margaret cherished every moment she had with them. She realized that family was the thread that held everything together. The people who grounded her, who reminded her of her purpose, and who filled her life with joy. One of the most important lessons Margaret had learned was that family wasn't perfect. There were times when she and Emily disagreed, when they didn't understand each other, or when they faced challenges. But through it all, Margaret learned that family was about unconditional love, acceptance, and forgiveness. It wasn't about being flawless. It was about being there for each other through the good times and the bad. Margaret also made an effort to reconnect with her extended family. Over the years, she had lost touch with many of her relatives, as life had a way of pulling people in different directions. But after Henry's death, Margaret realized how important it was to nurture these connections. She reached out to her cousins, her nieces, and nephews, and invited them to visit her more often. It was through these relationships that Margaret found a sense of belonging, a reminder that family could extend far beyond the immediate circle. There was one particular visit that stood out in Margaret's memory, a family reunion that she had organized at the local community center. It had been years since everyone had gathered together, and Margaret was determined to bring them all together again. She had put in a lot of effort to organize the event, and when the day arrived, she couldn't help but feel overwhelmed with emotion. As her relatives walked through the door, Margaret felt a deep sense of gratitude and love. Seeing her family all in one place, laughing, reminiscing, and sharing stories, reminded her of how important these connections were. "Mom," Emily said to her, "I can see how much this means to you. I'm so glad you brought everyone together." Margaret smiled, her heart full. It's so easy to forget how much family means when we're caught up in our own lives. But days like this remind me that the love we share is what truly matters. As the reunion came to a close, Margaret found herself feeling more content than she had in a long time. Surrounded by her family, she realized that this was what life was truly about. These moments of connection, of love, and of shared memories. She was no longer focused on the things she had lost, but on the things she still had: her family, her health, and the many blessings she had been given. That evening, as Margaret sat alone in her chair, reflecting on the day, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had spent her life searching for meaning, for purpose, and for success. But now she understood that true success wasn't measured by material achievements. It was measured by the love you gave and received, by the relationships you nurtured, and by the time you spent with the people who mattered most. Family, Margaret now knew, was everything. It was the foundation of her life, the source of her strength, and the key to finding joy in the simplest moments. No matter how much time had passed or how much her life had changed, she knew that her family would always be there for her, and that together they could weather any storm. Margaret sat by the window, a cup of tea in her hands as the sun began to set. The warm golden light filled the room, casting a peaceful glow over everything. It was one of those moments when time seemed to slow down, and she could truly appreciate the quiet beauty of the world around her. As she sat there, her thoughts drifted back to the many years she had lived, years that had been filled with both and sorrow, triumphs and losses. But one thing had remained constant throughout her life: her ability to find something to be grateful for, even in the most difficult times. She had learned that gratitude was not just an emotion, but a powerful force that could shape the way you experience the world. When Margaret was younger, she had often focused on what was missing from her life. She had spent so much time wishing for more success, more wealth, more recognition, that she had overlooked the many blessings she already had. It wasn't until later in life, after the loss of Henry and the challenges that followed, that she truly began to understand the transformative power of gratitude. In the aftermath of Henry's death, Margaret had been consumed with grief. For months, it felt as though she was drowning in sadness, unable to see beyond the pain of losing him. She had spent many nights crying herself to sleep, wondering how she would ever move forward without him by her side. But as time passed, Margaret began to realize something important. While she could never replace the love she had lost, she still had so much to be thankful for. One evening, as she sat alone in her living room, Margaret decided to start a gratitude journal. She had heard about the benefits of keeping a gratitude journal from a friend, and she thought it might help her find some peace amidst the sorrow. At first, it felt difficult. How could she possibly find things to be grateful for when her heart was broken? But as she sat there, pen in hand, she began to write. She started with simple things: her health, her home, the beautiful garden outside her window. Then she wrote about her children and grandchildren, the love and support they had given her through the years. As she continued writing, Margaret found that her list grew longer and longer. She realized that even though she had lost so much, there was still so much left in her life to be grateful for. The more Margaret wrote, the more she began to see things through a different lens. Gratitude, she realized, was not just about acknowledging the good things in her life. It was about shifting her perspective. Instead of focusing on what was missing, she started focusing on what she had. She realized that even in the darkest times, there was always something to be grateful for. Margaret also found that expressing gratitude helped her heal. It didn't make the pain go away, but it gave her a sense of peace. Each time she wrote in her journal, she felt a little lighter, a little more connected to the present moment. Gratitude became a daily practice, a way for her to find joy even when things felt difficult. One afternoon, Margaret was sitting in her garden, sipping her tea, when Emily came to visit. As they talked, Margaret shared what she had been doing to cope with her grief. "Mom," Emily said, "I've noticed something different about you lately. You seem more at peace, more content. What's changed?" Margaret smiled softly, her heart full. "I've been practicing gratitude, Emily. It's helped me see things differently. Instead of focusing on what I've lost, I've been focusing on what I still have. And I've realized that I have so much to be thankful for. It's not always easy, but every day I try to find something to appreciate, no matter how small." Emily listened intently, her eyes filled with understanding. "I think that's beautiful, Mom. I've been so focused on my own struggles that I haven't taken the time to appreciate what I have. I'm going to start doing that too." That evening, Emily began her own gratitude journal, just as her mother had done. Margaret smiled to herself, knowing that the power of gratitude would continue to ripple through their lives. She had taught Emily a valuable lesson, one that would help her navigate the challenges of life with a greater sense of peace and acceptance. As the days passed, Margaret found that gratitude was not just about writing things down in a journal. It was about living with an open heart, appreciating the people and experiences that enriched her life. She began to express her gratitude more freely, telling her loved ones how much they meant to her, acknowledging the kindness of strangers, and finding beauty in the everyday moments that so often went unnoticed. Margaret had learned that the true power of gratitude was in its ability to transform your perspective. It allowed her to see the good in the world, even when it seemed dark, and to find joy in the simplest things. It was a gift she had given herself, and it was a gift that had brought her a sense of peace and fulfillment that she had never known before. As she sat in her garden, watching the sun set behind the trees, Margaret felt a deep sense of contentment. She had lived a full life, and while there had been moments of pain and loss, there had also been moments of love, joy, and growth. And through it all, gratitude had been her constant companion, guiding her through the hard times and helping her appreciate the beauty in the world. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet thank you to the universe. She had learned that no matter what happened in life, there was always something to be grateful for, and that, she realized, was the key to finding peace and happiness in even the most challenging times. Margaret sat by the window, gazing out at the serene garden where the flowers were beginning to bloom. She felt a sense of peace wash over her as she watched the world outside, knowing that her journey was coming to its final chapter. At the age of 85, Margaret had lived a life full of experiences, some joyful, some painful, but all meaningful. She had learned countless lessons over the years, lessons that had shaped her into the woman she was today. One of the greatest gifts Margaret had received in her later years was the opportunity to pass on the wisdom she had accumulated over a lifetime. She realized that the knowledge she had gained, the lessons she had learned, were not just for her, they were meant to be shared. Her greatest hope now was that her children, grandchildren, and the people she loved would carry forward the wisdom she had to offer. Margaret had always been a quiet, introspective woman, but as she grew older, she became more intentional about sharing the lessons that had guided her through life. She spent time with her children and grandchildren, telling them stories about her youth, about the challenges she had faced, and about the moments that had shaped her. She spoke of the importance of resilience, of gratitude, and of the simple joys that life had to offer. One of the most important lessons Margaret wanted to pass on was the value of living in the present moment. She had spent so many years chasing after success, always thinking that happiness was something to be achieved in the future. But over time, She had learned that true happiness came from appreciating what was in front of you, from living fully in the moment, and from finding contentment in the simple pleasures of life. She remembered a conversation she had had with her granddaughter, Lily, just a few months ago. Lily had been struggling with her own sense of purpose, feeling lost in the hustle and bustle of life. She had been focused on getting ahead in her career, on making more money, on achieving the next big milestone. But Margaret had shared with her a simple truth that she had learned through years of experience. Lily, my dear, life is not about reaching a destination. It's about the journey, about the moments you experience along the way. Don't wait for happiness to come in the future. Find it in the present. Lily had listened intently, and Margaret could see the wheels turning in her granddaughter's mind. Margaret knew that it was sometimes difficult for younger generations to understand this idea. After all, they had their own goals and ambitions, but Margaret hoped that Lily would carry this lesson with her, that she would learn to appreciate the present and the people around her, rather than constantly striving for something that always seemed just out of reach. As Margaret spent more time with her family, she found herself reflecting on the legacy she wanted to leave behind. It wasn't about wealth or material possessions. It was about the values she had instilled in her children and grandchildren, the love and wisdom she had shared, and the impact she had made on the people around her. She had always believed that true success was measured by the relationships you built, the kindness you gave, and the way you made others feel. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Margaret shared her thoughts with Emily. "I've been thinking a lot about legacy," she said softly. "It's not about what we leave behind in terms of things, but the love, the wisdom, and the lessons we pass on to others. I want you and the kids to remember the things that truly matter, the importance of family, of kindness, of resilience, and of gratitude." Emily looked at her mother with a gentle smile. "Mom, you've already given us so much. The way you've lived your life, the way you've loved us, that's the legacy we'll carry with us forever." Margaret smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment in her heart. She knew that her time was limited, but she also knew that her legacy would live on in the hearts of those she loved. She had done her best to impart the wisdom she had gained over the years, and she trusted that her family would carry these lessons into the future. In the months that followed, Margaret continued to share her stories and wisdom with her family. She spent time with her grandchildren, telling them stories about her childhood, about the challenges she had faced, and about the lessons she had learned along the way. She spoke to them about the importance of kindness, the value of time, and the strength of resilience. One day, as Margaret was sitting on the porch with her youngest grandson, Samuel, he asked her a simple question that caught her off guard. "Grandma, what's the most important thing you've learned in your life?" Margaret thought for a moment, looking out at the horizon. "I think the most important thing I've learned, Samuel, is that life is precious. It's not about how much you have, but about how you live. It's about the love you give, the people you care for, and the moments you cherish. Life is full of challenges, but it's also full of beauty. And the key to a happy life is finding joy in the small things." Samuel smiled up at her, his eyes filled with curiosity. "I want to be like you, Grandma. I want to be kind and strong like you." Margaret's heart swelled with love. She had spent her life striving to be a good person, to pass on the wisdom she had learned, and to leave behind a legacy that her family could be proud of. In that moment, she realized that her legacy was already alive in her grandchildren, in the way they spoke to her and the way they looked at life. She had done her part. As the years went on, Margaret continued to live with intention. sharing her wisdom and love with those around her. She knew that her time on this earth was limited, but she also knew that the lessons she had learned would live on, carried forward by her children, her grandchildren, and the many lives she had touched. One evening, as she sat in her favorite chair, watching the sunset one last time, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. She had lived a life full of love, resilience, and wisdom. She had learned that the true measure of a life well lived was not in the achievements or the accolades, but in the relationships, the love, and the legacy that you left behind. As the stars twinkled in the night sky, Margaret closed her eyes, content in the knowledge that her wisdom would continue to guide her family for generations to come.